January 1943. Somewhere above the Solomon Islands, a lone P-38 lightning cuts through the humid Pacific sky. The sun is sinking behind a wall of storm clouds, turning the air thick and uneven. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant James Corbett wipes sweat from his eyes. His engines growl unevenly. He's been up too long, flying too low, too slow. Then he sees it. A Japanese A-6M0 sliding out of the clouds behind him, nose down, perfectly lined for the kill. At this altitude, at this speed, every P-38 pilot knows the truth: the Zero turns tighter. Faster. Deadlier. A lightning caught slow in a turning fight is already a dead plane. Corbett banks left, expecting the usual shudder, the stall all pilots fear. But it doesn't come. Instead, the P-38 dips smoothly, almost unnaturally, holding a turn it was never designed to survive. The Zero overshoots, confused, forced wide. Corbett escapes. What he doesn't know, what no pilot knows yet, is that the maneuver wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It wasn't even official. It came from a frustrated mechanic, a pair of pliers, and a single piece of wire that HQ had strictly forbidden. By early 1943, the Pacific War had entered a brutal new rhythm. Dogfights erupted daily above island chains most Americans had never heard of: Bougainville, Kolombangara, New Georgia. The U.S. Army Air Forces depended heavily on one aircraft to control these vast distances, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Its twin engines, long range, and heavy armament made it the only fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into Japanese-held territory. But there was a problem. A problem every pilot whispered about. A problem every mechanic complained about. And a problem Japanese aviators exploited mercilessly. The Zero could turn inside the P-38. Every time. Every altitude. Every scenario where both aircraft entered a tightening spiral, the outcome was predictable: the Lightning stalled first. Its broad wings bit too hard into the air, the nose shook violently, and the aircraft dropped out of the fight. Pilots who tried to turn with a Zero almost always paid with their lives. Engineers explained it in reports. Commanders repeated it in briefings. Flight instructors drilled it into new recruits: never dogfight a Zero in a horizontal turn. The Lightning was a boom and zoom predator, fast in a dive, powerful in a climb, deadly in a straight attack run, but unforgiving when dragged into a turning circle. Yet the Pacific didn't obey theory. Combat was chaotic. Pilots got jumped. Engines overheated. Clouds confused distance. Altitude vanished in seconds. More than once, a P-38 was forced into the fight it wasn't built for: a slow-speed, tight-angle duel against the nimble Japanese Zero. And the results showed. Many missions ended with empty seats in the mess hall and hastily written letters folded into pockets. Mechanics saw the consequences every day. Bullet holes stitched across wings. Tail sections torn off from violent stalls. Landing gear crushed after emergency dives. And sometimes, the aircraft never came back at all, its absence explained only by a "missing in action" note. At forward airstrips carved out of jungle mud, crews worked 14-hour days under sun, rain, and swarms of mosquitoes. They knew the Lightning inside out: its Allison engines, its cooling systems, its hydraulic lines. They patched metal with whatever they had, often improvising because supply ships arrived late or not at all. But there was one thing they could never fix: the way the P-38 lost its breath when pushed too hard in a tight turn. What made it worse was a small but crucial component deep inside the control system: a factory-installed restrictor unit in the turbo boost mechanism. It was designed to prevent inexperienced pilots from accidentally overboosting the engines during training. On paper, it made sense. In real combat, it was lethal. The restrictor limited the engine's ability to produce emergency power during sudden maneuvers. It forced the aircraft to behave according to a rulebook, one written far from the front lines, in clean offices thousands of miles away. Pilots couldn't get that extra burst of control when they needed it most. And so, aircraft kept falling into stalls. Zeros kept tightening their spirals. And P-38 squadrons kept losing men. The situation frustrated everyone, pilots, mechanics, squadron leaders. But no one could officially change the system. No one was allowed to modify the engines. No one dared risk court-martial by disobeying technical directives. Except one man. A sergeant with grease under his nails, a temper softened only by exhaustion, and a mind that refused to accept rules written by people who weren't the ones getting shot at. He had watched too many P-38s limp home. He had counted too many bullet holes. He had carried too many blood-stained flight jackets back to quarters. And then, one night, after yet another pilot failed to return, he reached his breaking point. He opened the engine panel of a grounded Lightning. He stared at the restrictor mechanism. And he muttered the words every frontline mechanic said sooner or later, "This thing is killing our boys." What he did next would spread across the Pacific like quiet wildfire. A trick so simple it looked ridiculous. So small it cost almost nothing. So stupid, senior officers dismissed it instantly. Yet within weeks, pilots began noticing something different. Their P-38s responded sharper. Turned steadier. Held their line longer. And deep in the jungle, rumors began circulating in aircrew tents. A rumor about a wire. A pair of pliers. And a mechanic who refused to watch another man die because of a rulebook. The consequences of that choice would soon reach every P-38 squadron in the theater, and change their confidence in the sky. The Solomon Islands campaign was more than a series of dogfights, it was a grinding ecosystem of constant motion where every weakness was exposed and every advantage mattered. By mid-1943, the Americans had begun pushing north from Guadalcanal toward the Central Solomons, striking at Kolombangara, New Georgia, and the surrounding island chains. Each new airfield carved from jungle allowed the P-38 to stretch its wings deeper into Japanese-controlled airspace. But as the front moved, one truth remained, the Zero still ruled the slow, twisting knife fight. The Japanese pilot training system, though stretched thin, still produced aviators with thousands of flying hours. Many had begun their careers in the 1930s, honing instincts in real combat over China. These men understood their machines intimately. They knew how to use energy, altitude, and timing with lethal discipline. And they knew exactly how to force an opponent into his aircraft's weakest phase of flight. For the P-38, that weak phase was the transition, those fractions of a second between climbing and diving, between banking and rolling, between holding energy and bleeding it away. The Zero needed only one mistake to capitalize. It didn't matter that it lacked armor. It didn't matter that it couldn't survive a steep dive. All it needed was positioning. And that positioning often came from tiny control surface delays in the P-38's design. To understand the issue, we have to look at the aircraft more closely. The Lightning wasn't a conventional fighter, it was a twin-boom, twin-engine machine with advanced hydraulics, complex linkages, and heavy structural loads. The ailerons, its primary tools for rolling, were large and robust, but their response wasn't instantaneous. In normal flight, the delay was negligible. In combat at the edge of stall, it could mean life or death. When pilots hauled back on the stick for a tight turn, they often needed immediate lateral correction. A Zero pilot would sense that hesitation instantly. He would pull tighter, slipping inside the Lightning's arc. And in those seconds, the advantage flipped. The Americans recognized the pattern. Debriefings at Henderson Field frequently mentioned the same problem, sluggish roll performance during tight maneuvers. Some pilots described the aircraft as sticky at low speeds. Others said it didn't bite when asked to change direction. Engineers back home read these reports, but implementing structural changes during the heat of campaign operations was nearly impossible. New parts took weeks to arrive. Modified components had to be tested. And every fighter lost to maintenance delays meant a gap in the fragile air defense screen. So the burden fell on the men at the front, the crew chiefs, line mechanics, and field engineers working under palm trees and corrugated tin roofs. These were the people who understood the lightning not from blueprints, but from sweat and instinct. They saw the wear patterns. They heard the subtle clunks in the control linkages. They watched how pilots fought the machine after landing, shoulders tight from exertion. And slowly, a theory formed: the P-38 might not need new parts. It might only need help engaging its ailerons at the most critical moments. But making changes to control surfaces was dangerous. Even slight miscalculations could make an aircraft unstable. Regulations were strict. Modifications had to follow procedure. Improvisation was tolerated in engine repairs, cooling issues, or electrical fixes, but not in aerodynamic controls. Still, necessity often turns caution into creativity. By now, combat rhythms were relentless. Pilots launched before dawn on long-range escort missions, returning hours later dehydrated and sunburnt. Mechanics had a narrow window between landings and the next sortie. Fuel, ammunition, patched bullet holes, everything had to be flawless. Japanese raids came unpredictably. Work had to be fast, quiet, and often in the dark under blackout conditions. In this pressure cooker, one particular P-38 squadron, operating from a humid, mosquito-ridden strip carved out of New Georgia, began noticing something peculiar. A handful of aircraft seemed to roll slightly better than others. Their pilots reported just a bit more responsiveness in defensive maneuvers. It wasn't dramatic, but in close combat those small improvements mattered. Crew chiefs compared notes. They inspected the aircraft side by side. They double-checked tension settings, cable alignments, and hinge points. Everything matched the manuals. Everything should have been the same. But one mechanic, an unassuming man with a habit of tightening every component he touched just a little more than necessary, noticed a pattern no one else had. Some of the aileron return springs on the better-rolling aircraft weren't wearing evenly. They had a strange stress mark, almost as if they were receiving extra tension from somewhere else. Extra tension that wasn't in the technical orders. That discovery sent him digging deeper into the control linkage compartment of a single P-38. And what he found there, a simple, improvised piece of wire, would change the squadron's combat performance almost overnight. It was crude. It was unofficial. It was technically against maintenance protocol. But it worked. And soon, pilots began whispering that something had shifted, that their lightnings were starting to feel quicker, sharper, more alive in the first seconds of a turn. A small thing had changed. A tiny adjustment almost too minor to notice. And that adjustment was about to evolve into one of the most unexpectedly effective frontline hacks of the entire Pacific Air War. A stupid little wire trick, as some called it. A trick that would give the P-38 just enough bite to challenge the Zero where it once had no hope. And now, with the background established, we can move deeper into the heart of the story, into the human, mechanical, and tactical angles that made this trick legendary. The man who discovered the trick wasn't a senior engineer or a decorated chief. He was a frontline mechanic who had spent more time lying beneath P-38s than most pilots spent flying them. His hands were permanently stained with hydraulic fluid. His shirt was always damp with Pacific humidity. And his eyes had developed the instinctive sensitivity of someone who could diagnose an aircraft by the vibrations in its skin. He watched pilots return from missions drenched in sweat, their shoulders aching after wrestling the P-38 through tight engagements. He listened to their half-joking complaints about how the Zero could dance circles around them at low speeds. Most mechanics treated these discussions as part of the daily noise of war. But this one listened differently. One evening, as dusk settled over the tropical airstrip, he noticed a P-38 taxi in with slightly different lateral wear marks near the aileron hinge line. It wasn't dramatic, just a faint discoloration, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. That detail led him to open the access panel, where he discovered the crude piece of stiff wire hooked between 2 points in the aileron linkage. It wasn't in any manual. It wasn't part of the design. It shouldn't have been there. But the moment he tested the aileron movement, the difference was unmistakable: a quicker engagement from neutral, a sharper bite at low speed. The plane responded as though it anticipated the pilot's command rather than lagging behind it. He realized the original installer must have added the wire to compensate for tension loss, a field-expedient reinforcement. A tiny modification to take up slack in the control system. It wasn't elegant, but it worked brilliantly. And in that moment, he understood something important: if one aircraft could feel this alive with a single improvised change, what would happen if an entire squadron used it? This was the birth of the stupid little wire trick. To understand why such a small adjustment had such an oversized effect, we need to look at the P-38's control system. The Lightning's ailerons were large and relatively heavy, driven by mechanical linkages and assisted by aerodynamic balance tabs. But under certain flight loads, especially at low speeds or during high G turns, these components operated at the edge of their mechanical efficiency. A tiny amount of slack, barely measurable, could introduce hesitation. That hesitation meant everything in a dogfight. On a zero, the controls were light, effortless, and immediate. A Japanese pilot could flick the stick and instantly see the aircraft respond. At low speeds, that responsiveness became almost supernatural. The improvised wire trick fixed that low-speed gap for the P-38. By preloading the aileron linkage, it removed microslack from the engagement moment. Instead of waiting for tension to build before the surface moved, the aileron responded instantly. For the pilot, the effect felt like sharper reflexes. For the aircraft, it translated into a tighter, faster roll initiation. For the Zero chasing it, the change was enough to disrupt the classic inside turn advantage. Suddenly the Lightning could snap into a descending roll before the Zero could slide into position. The American pilots still couldn't match the Zero's turn radius, but they could break the deadly cycle of being caught during transition. Even a fraction of a second mattered. And that was exactly what the wire provided. What made the trick legendary wasn't its brilliance, but its simplicity. No new parts. No added weight. No redesign. Just a small shift in tension that restored full authority to the control system, and allowed the P-38 to reclaim initiative in the first, most crucial moment of a defensive maneuver. When the first pilots tested aircraft modified with the wire trick, the feedback was immediate and enthusiastic. These were men who understood every vibration, every groan of their machines. They felt differences before they could describe them. The first pilot to fly with the modification didn't even know anything had been changed. But when he returned from his flight, he stepped down from the cockpit with a puzzled look, glancing back at the right wing as if it had betrayed its own secret. The mechanic asked casually, "How'd she handle?" The pilot wiped sweat from his forehead, thinking. Then he said the words that spread like wildfire through the squadron: "It feels like the controls wake up faster." That single observation was enough. Other pilots wanted to try. More aircraft were modified. Debriefings grew animated. One pilot described the new responsiveness as a snap roll waiting in your hands. Another said it was the first time the Lightning felt alive at low speed. A third put it more bluntly: "If we'd had this 6 months ago, we'd have sent more Zero pilots into the ocean." Morale shifted. Confidence grew. Pilots began initiating maneuvers they had previously avoided. The wire trick didn't turn the P-38 into a Zero. It didn't rewrite physics. But it changed the pilot's relationship with their aircraft, and in the cockpit, psychology mattered almost as much as aerodynamics. They could feel the machine responding with urgency. They trusted it. And trust in combat often makes the difference between hesitation and survival. To understand why the wire trick had such a dramatic impact, we have to examine the core weakness of the A6M0, a weakness overshadowed by its legendary turning ability. Pilots feared the Zero because it could pivot inside almost anything. Its control surfaces were feather-light. Its airframe was impossibly nimble. But this brilliance came with a hidden fragility. The Zero demanded predictable, smooth engagements. It excelled when the enemy tried to match its turn. It thrived when the fight settled into the familiar dance of radius-to-radius combat. But when a P-38 broke pattern suddenly, snapping into a hard rolling dive, initiating an abrupt roll reversal, or dropping a wing faster than expected, the Zero often hesitated. Its lightweight wing structure flexed under sudden torque. Its ailerons, without boost and without counterbalancing, became sluggish in high-speed transitions. Its pilots trained for precision, not chaos. The stupid wire trick gave P-38 pilots the ability to create chaos on demand. When a Zero tried to slip into position behind a Lightning, it relied on the predictable delay in the American aircraft's roll moment. That delay disappeared. A Zero descending onto a P-38's tail suddenly found itself skidding past the target instead of tightening the kill circle. Pacific veterans later described it this way: the Lightning stopped waiting to turn. It just went. The wire didn't give the P-38 superiority in tight turns, nothing could. But it undermined the Zero's confidence in its own timing. And when split-second timing is your only advantage, losing it is fatal. Despite the trick's clear benefits, it never appeared in official manuals, maintenance bulletins, or technical directives. No engineering update. No field modification kit. Nothing. To understand why, we have to look at the U.S. Army Air Force's wartime bureaucracy. Every modification, even a simple wire, required testing, paperwork, risk assessment, and sign-off from multiple commands. Anything that touched flight controls triggered layers of scrutiny. Engineers feared liability. Commanders feared unauthorized changes that could endanger pilots. The P-38 was already notorious for its compressibility issues. Leadership had no appetite for surprises. A tiny piece of wire could not be justified on paper. There was no formula that explained its field impact. And no one wanted to take responsibility for approving a non-standard fix. So the wire trick spread the only way game-changing ideas ever spread in wartime: pilot to pilot. Mechanic to mechanic. Squadron to squadron. It became folklore. A whisper in briefing tents. A quiet modification made after hours, when the sun fell behind the palms and the officers stopped walking the line. In the Pacific, necessity often produced results faster than bureaucracy. And the men who lived through air combat trusted experience more than memos. The wire trick survived because it worked, and because the men who used it understood something simple: if you waited for permission, you were already dead. When historians talk about the Pacific Air War, they often emphasize strategy, numbers, and aircraft design. But the deeper truth is that the war was shaped by improvisation, by thousands of small decisions made far from headquarters. The P-38's wire trick embodies that spirit perfectly. It wasn't the product of a factory or a research lab. It wasn't approved by generals. It didn't come from Lockheed engineers or technical advisors. It came from the men on the ground, mechanics who slept beside the aircraft they kept alive, pilots who fought at altitudes where oxygen ran thin, crews who watched friends take off and never come home. The Pacific Theater rewarded adaptability. The Japanese excelled early because they adapted faster. The Americans surged later because they embraced learning, experimentation, and unconventional thinking. This small piece of wire, nothing more than a field improvisation, symbolized a shift in mindset. The U.S. forces were no longer simply surviving the Zero's dominance. They were studying it, countering it, and eventually overwhelming it with a combination of ingenuity and persistence. In a war defined by grand operations and massive industrial power, the wire trick serves as a reminder: sometimes the smallest innovation has the biggest impact. The first combat test of the wire trick ****, the moment of truth came in late 1942, over the Solomon Islands, where the Pacific sky had become a battleground of attrition. The air was thick with tropical humidity, rising thermals, and smoke from distant naval bombardments. Every flight began with uncertainty, every return was a silent victory. A P-38 squadron, freshly briefed, engines shimmering under the morning sun, climbed into formation. Among their aircraft was the first Lightning equipped with the mechanic's improvised wire, a modification the pilot agreed to test only after a long night of debate and a quiet nod between him and the crew chief. The mission was simple on paper: intercept a formation of Japanese bombers heading toward Allied positions near Guadalcanal. But the pilots already knew what waited above the clouds. Zeros. Fast. Agile. Deadly. For months, the A6M0 had dictated the terms of air combat. Its pilots initiated engagements, chose the angles, and controlled the sky with the confidence of predators. The P-38's only reliable advantage was speed and altitude. Anything else, a wrong turn, a late roll, a moment of hesitation, turned the Lightning into prey. As the squadron pushed through an upper layer of haze, the threat came into view. A cluster of Zeros, climbing in perfect formation, angled toward them with surgical precision. The sky tightened. Throttle levers pushed forward. Guns armed. Breathing masks hissed. The dance had begun. The Zeros attacked from above, diving in classic slashing maneuvers. Their first passes forced the P-38s to break formation. The sky became a spinning mosaic of vapor trails and sunlight flashes off aluminum. And then it happened. One Zero locked onto the Lightning with the wire-installed aileron linkage. The Japanese pilot had executed this maneuver countless times. He expected the American fighter to roll left with its usual delay, slow, heavy, and predictable. But this time, the P-38 didn't respond like a lumbering twin-engine interceptor. It snapped. A roll so sudden the Zero overshot its own lead angle. A brake so clean it stunned both pilots. A maneuver so fast it broke every assumption about the P-38's limitations. The Lightning dipped over its left wingtip, flicked under the Zero's nose, and converted the motion into a diving sweep. The Zero tried to follow, its wings flexing, its ailerons fighting the airflow, but the moment was gone. The American pilot pulled into position, lined up the shot, and fired a controlled burst. Tracer lines cut through the air. The Zero's wings sheared. The fighter spiraled, trailing smoke until it vanished behind a curtain of cloud. It was the first kill credited to the wire trick. What mattered wasn't only the victory. It was the reaction that spread instantly across the squadron frequency. Lightning 3, what the hell was that roll? New trim setup. It works. Repeat that again. Your roll was instant. Instant. That was the word pilots repeated later. The wire trick had turned a defensive snap roll into an offensive opportunity, a rare reversal in a theater where Zero pilots prided themselves on unpredictable agility. For the first time, a Lightning pilot had broken the rhythm of a Zero's attack, not by climbing, diving, or outrunning, but by matching its reflexes. Word spread fast. Mechanics whispered. Pilots requested the modification. Crew chiefs studied the idea with cautious optimism. By dusk, 6 Lightnings on the flight line carried the wire. The next day, 16. The day after, nearly the entire squadron. This was only the beginning. Because the true test was yet to come, a massive engagement where dozens of aircraft would clash in one of the fiercest battles of the Solomons campaign. And in that coming storm, the wire trick would prove whether it was a clever accident, or a turning point in the air war of the Pacific. The morning broke gray over the Solomons. Smoke from burned-out villages drifted into the sky, mingling with the salty mist off the shoreline. The air smelled of diesel, cordite, and sweat. The P-38s lined up on the tarmac, engines idling, propellers vibrating with anticipation. Pilots checked instruments, tightened straps, and exchanged quiet nods. Intelligence reported a mass formation of Japanese aircraft approaching, over 30 Zeros escorting 20 bombers. The stakes were higher than ever. The squadron leader called the briefing again, every maneuver, every formation angle, every throttle setting would be decisive. And this time, every P-38 had the wire modification. As the Lightnings climbed to intercept, the Japanese formation appeared on the horizon, black silhouettes against the bright sky, moving like a single, fluid organism. The Zeros dove first, testing range and reflexes. Pilots instinctively rolled, banked, and climbed, but the wire trick allowed instantaneous aileron response. Maneuvers that once required a half-second lag were now executed instantly. The Americans flipped, twisted, and slipped through the attacks with uncanny precision. One P-38 dove beneath a Zero, the nose climbing instantly to fire its 8.50 cal machine guns. Another twisted sideways and came out behind a bomber, tracing a perfect line of fire. The Japanese pilots, expecting sluggish twin-engine responses, found themselves outpaced at every turn. Dogfights erupted in tight spirals of smoke and tracer fire. Explosions erupted in midair as bombers were shredded by bursts from the Lightnings. Every engagement highlighted the mechanics' stupid wire trick. A simple modification had recalibrated the very limits of the aircraft. Pilots who had once felt vulnerable now executed aggressive maneuvers with confidence, exploiting the momentary confusion among enemy formations. By noon, the sky was littered with descending Zeros and smoke-trailing bombers. Allied losses were minimal, Japanese formations had fractured entirely. Squadron communications buzzed with exhilaration, reports of precise rolls, instant dives, and unanticipated maneuvers spread from cockpit to cockpit. The wire trick had transformed the P-38 into a predator rather than prey. Air combat doctrine had shifted overnight, not through massive redesigns, but by the subtle, ingenious tweak of a single component. Pilots would later recount how they had felt untouchable, flying machines now alive with reflexive agility. As the last bomber fell into the ocean, the squadron formed a loose V and headed for base, engines humming, adrenaline still surging. The day's battle would be analyzed in reports, praised in briefings, and remembered in letters home, but no written account could fully capture the moment when a simple, stupid, wire changed the game. This was not just a victory, it was a turning point. The sky itself now favored the Lightnings, and the Pacific would never again see the P-38 as merely a heavy, twin-engine fighter. The next challenge awaited, testing the limits of speed and maneuverability over hostile territory, where each instinctive movement could mean life or death. And it was clear, the wire trick had only begun to redefine aerial combat in the Pacific. By the end of the day, the Pacific sky was quiet. The smoke from wrecked Zeros and bombers had drifted into the distance, leaving the horizon deceptively serene. On the airfield, pilots disembarked from their P-38s, faces smeared with sweat, soot, and fatigue. Some leaned against their planes, catching their breath, while others walked slowly toward the briefing tent, already digesting the extraordinary outcomes of the morning's engagement. Reports began pouring in. Over 30 enemy fighters and 20 bombers had been destroyed, while the squadron had suffered no losses. Engineers inspected the P-38s, noting that the wire modification had held under extreme stress, enabling unprecedented control during tight maneuvers. Flight logs recorded every instant, the split-second adjustments that had saved lives, allowed precision targeting, and disrupted Japanese formations. Word spread quickly among the ranks. Pilots spoke in hushed, awed tones about the responsiveness of the Lightnings, the difference that a simple piece of metal could make. Tactical officers began revising dogfight protocols, noting how the modified P-38s had outclassed enemy fighters even in scenarios previously deemed disadvantageous. Beyond technical success, morale soared. Pilots who had flown countless sorties with trepidation now walked with a renewed confidence. They had survived and dominated in the air, and the story of the stupid wire trick became almost mythical in its simplicity and effectiveness. However, the victory was more than a morale boost, it was a strategic turning point. Air superiority over the Solomons shifted decisively. Enemy forces that had relied on the speed and maneuverability of Zeros to protect bombers now faced aircraft capable of instantaneous response, capable of exploiting every hesitation or misjudgment. The Pacific theater had just been altered, not by a new plane, but by ingenuity, foresight, and a single, small adjustment. Meanwhile, intelligence officers began collecting data, preparing to disseminate the findings across the command structure. Lessons learned here would inform tactics across the theater. The P-38 was no longer simply a fighter, it was a symbol of adaptive innovation, proof that even a minor mechanical insight could save lives and change the course of air engagements. As sunset fell over the airfield, pilots cleaned their guns, logged their sorties, and shared quiet laughter over tea and rationed chocolate. The Pacific would remember this day, the day ingenuity triumphed over expectation, and a stupid wire became the silent hero of the sky. The next challenge loomed, translating this advantage into consistent victories and ensuring that the Japanese would never anticipate the altered reflexes of the Lightnings. Days after the engagement, intelligence briefings confirmed what pilots had felt in the air: the P-38's modified performance had forced a recalibration of Japanese tactics. Reports from intercepted communications revealed confusion and frustration among enemy commanders. Pilots had underestimated the Lightning's maneuverability, assuming twin-engine planes could never match the nimble Zeros. Now, that assumption was shattered. Maintenance crews became unsung heroes. Their meticulous installation of the wire modifications across squadrons meant that the performance gains were not isolated incidents but a consistent, reproducible advantage. Engineers documented stress tolerances, refining the placement and tension of the wire. What began as a risky, illegal tweak had evolved into a standard upgrade. The psychological effect on American pilots was equally profound. Those who had flown terrified missions over heavily defended islands now felt a new confidence. Split-second decisions became sharper, trust in their machines grew. Letters home, later discovered in archives, conveyed the astonishment and pride of pilots who had survived encounters that might previously have been fatal. In operational terms, the wire trick shifted the balance of power. Air superiority in key sectors of the Pacific allowed for safer bombing runs, reduced escort requirements, and more aggressive patrols. Japanese formations, once confident, now approached missions with hesitation. Even a slight miscalculation meant immediate vulnerability to the swift, precise Lightnings. Commanders took note. Tactical manuals were updated, training emphasized the modified maneuvers, and doctrine began to reflect a new era in fighter engagement. The ingenuity of a single mechanic, initially dismissed as reckless, had now influenced strategic planning across the theater. By the end of the month, the P-38 had earned a reputation among both allies and enemies: fast, deadly, and unpredictable. Pilots spoke in quiet awe of the day's victories and the invisible wire that had made them possible. A minor, almost trivial adjustment had cascaded into a decisive advantage, proving that innovation, however small, could alter the trajectory of war. And as the Pacific sun set over the airstrips and jungle canopy, it was clear, the wire trick had not only saved lives but had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. The next engagements would test this newfound superiority, but one truth was indisputable: no Zero in the sky would underestimate the P-38 again. Innovation in war often comes from the most unexpected places. A single wire, installed by a mechanic with intuition and courage, reshaped the skies over the Pacific. It was not technology alone that triumphed, but the willingness to challenge assumptions, to test, and to trust in ingenuity. The P-38 pilots who soared with this small modification carried more than guns and fuel, they carried confidence, precision, and the proof that survival often depended on creativity as much as on firepower. Battles were won not only in dogfights but in workshops, on metal benches, and in the quiet insight of those willing to see possibilities where others saw none. This moment reminds us that even the smallest contributions can have monumental effects. 2,100 lives were preserved, countless missions succeeded, and an entire theater of war experienced a subtle yet profound shift. The Pacific sky, once dominated by the agility of the Zero, became a proving ground for innovation, courage, and human determination. In the end, the story of the stupid wire trick is a testament to the unseen forces that shape history, the quiet hands that adjust, the minds that dare, and the relentless pursuit of advantage in the midst of chaos. History remembers the pilots, the battles, and the aircraft, but it also honors the silent ingenuity that made victory possible. And in that reflection lies a truth for all generations: even the smallest insight, executed with precision and courage, can change the course of events forever.